Fasten your seatbelts. Mark Masterson.
Thank you. You're going to be a tough act to follow. And usually I'm the guy standing up here with the Eric Ries slide, so that was very cool. Lots of startup-y stuff in that. That's also a nice segue because you use a lot of words like co-creation and crowdsourcing that I am going to be talking about at, to riff off a joke from Luke's talk earlier, a very French level in the sense I'm going to be very meta now, okay? And before I do that, therefore, I'm going to walk the talk, and I'm going to engage in a conversation with Jo, and I'm going to say two things in response to her talk. First off, mixed panel, but we're aware of what a pain in the ass Google Analytics is to use, and in particular, we're also aware that it's way too freaking expensive for tiny bootstrap startups, which are my usual constituencies, but it's probably the same problem for you. Therefore, go Google a thing called Firebase Analytics. It's free. The other thing that I would say is, with regard to kind of the stuff that Jo taught that you should be thinking about working on, blah, 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 apps. I would be very surprised if it made sense for any of you to actually be developing a native app. And if you're doing that, I would caution you that you probably need to be aware of some alternatives to that. In particular, one that we've been spending a lot of time working on very recently that you should also go Google is called a progressive web app, PWA. Go have a look. All right. I am now going to attempt to make your heads explode. This is how I described it to Nick. And I will either fail spectacularly or there'll be blood all over the room. So either way, it's probably going to end poorly. This is, and we're having those usual technical problems with transitions and things. This is, wow, that's really cool. Kind of behind the words there, you can see my next slide slowly coming in. Probably the picture is too big. This is what a commercial transaction used to look like. This is a marketplace. And a transaction in this context is very conversational. It's full of all kinds of interactive things with very short feedback loops. Traditionally, things like haggling, random asides, conversations, insults even. And you don't have to go to Marrakesh, which is where this picture that you can't see is from, to see that sort of thing, because any good New York deli will give you the same thing. Keep talking, we're gonna sure. Any good New York deli will give you the same thing, especially the insults. In London, kind of maybe, I don't know, Borough Market, but you don't really get the insults because Brits are too polite. But the idea is that you're engaged in this very tight, short conversational feedback. And that was what all transactions used to look like. However, this model doesn't scale very well. You can't sell to 100 customers that way, or 1,000, or 1,000,000. And so in the early 20th century, one of the most profound innovations that happened to us as a species, and caveat, most of the things I'm going to be talking about here seem to manifest themselves primarily in the Western world. So I will be speaking as if the world is the Western world for a lot of this talk. I'm fully aware that it's not so, but again, Jo gives me another great segue. William Gibson, the future is not evenly distributed. And so again, the things that we're talking about here are the things kind of where the puck is moving, right? So broadcast technologies in the Western world, at the end of the Second World War in particular, radically changed the way the world works in ways that, for many of us, are no longer transparent. So the primary technology that drove that transformation was the television. And taking one and putting it in a post-war suburban house was the very first step towards this radical transformation that completely reshaped society. One of the things that is not commonly known, particularly to those of us who were born long after all of this happened, was that the changes that were going on at that period were affecting things that didn't seem like they were directly correlated to what was happening. So for example, who's heard of a place in New York called Levittown? Ever heard that word before? Levittown? Fascinating story. So Levittown is literally, in the United States, the very first proper suburban housing estate of the kind that you would now kind of metaphorically associate instantly with what that word means, kind of the Steven Spielberg scene with the kids riding down their bicycles and little sidewalks and all. Levittown was the first one. And what's really interesting about Levittown is the people who came back from here after the Second World War, who had been trained by the very frightening spies, who here at the time were the primary kind of folk, you know, the OSI and all of that, either went to found the CIA or they went to Madison Avenue, right? And the ones that went to Madison Avenue were involved in the development of this Levittown estate. And they helped design the architecture of the buildings, the architecture of the state itself. There were studies done that worked out how far should the house be set back from the curb to make room for the car? How far does the estate need to be from the shops to force you to buy a car because that's the only way you can get to the shops? How far does the refrigerator, the space that we're going to put for it in the kitchen, need to be from the television to make sure that you get up just enough times to go to the refrigerator to continue to consume from the refrigerator while I send commercials at you? This was designed into Levittown. And because it was the first one, it became the pattern that everyone simply copied. Most of the time, without really understanding what they were copying, like all good memes, it just became ubiquitous. And now we all live in houses like that. That mechanism drove the economy after the Second World War. It forced us to buy cars, to buy refrigerators, to buy washing machines, and all of the other things. And doing so then, ultimately, let me fast forward through some of the pictures I've been talking about. This, in one of these, yeah, we're going to have the same problem. All my pictures are too high density. This is Levittown. After the Second World War, that pattern then spread, as all good memes do. So in the sense that a technology is just a tool or a thing that humans think up to help them do other things, this is a technology. This is a way of distributing goods, and it's a broadcast model, just like broadcasting commercials is. The manner of distributing things evolved along with this demand and the ways that people were consuming things. So did organizations. This is General Motors' organization chart from 1932, 1933, something like it. And it's a broadcast model. It broadcasts power from the top down to the bottom, right? This is a very early picture of the New York Stock Exchange. It was once a profoundly conversational marketplace, not dissimilar to the marketplace in Marrakesh. This is a Bloomberg terminal. The trading floor is gone. If you go to the New York Stock Exchange now, you'll find it's kind of like a Disneyland sort of thing, a tourist attraction. There's nobody on the freaking floor anymore because they're all sitting somewhere in a dark corner doing short trades like in those horrible movies about the 2008 crash. Joe said, you know, back in 1999, like that was a really long time ago. Dude, I'm so old. This book was published in 1999. Has anyone ever read it? So this book is very famous, but it, like Levittown, has kind of become part of the underlying fabric of what's going on around us. This book famously posited that all markets are conversational, even in the broadcast era. And that what had happened in the broadcast era was that broadcast technologies had essentially distorted the conversation, creating a one-to-many sort of a thing, and that it was not sociologically sustainable, that we would eventually circle back to conversational markets. And what they were positing was that what we were waiting for was the equivalent of the television, some technology that would allow us to have conversations at scale, and as soon as that happened, boom, the broadcast economy would die. They famously asserted, and this is a picture of the World Wide Web from about 1999, that the internet was that technology, and that, wow, now all of a sudden things would change. 20 years later, that seems wildly optimistic. And instead, what I think we can now say is that the internet kind of serves as plumbing, as the infrastructure for this emerging conversational marketplace, conversational economy, similar to a the mere distribution of power wasn't enough to create the broadcast economy, nor was the creation of a thing like radio, which actually invented broadcast advertising. But it had to wait for the television to come before the broadcast economy went like a mushroom cloud. I think the Clue Train manifesto was a bit optimistic about one other thing too, or a bit too assertive. They kind of portrayed this as a rip and replace paradigm, and of course nothing ever works that way. You know, to Joe's point about a maturity continuum, things layer on top of other things, and the old things never really go away. They just get smaller or become niche or whatever. So conversational marketplaces never went away. The broadcast economy didn't even really, from some perceptual level, layer on top of it. What it did was it opened up an entire new conceptual space to us that we could not have imagined before. If I go back in time, in my Google time machine that you're not allowed to use, to about 1912, and I say to someone, let's play to the camera. They do not know what I'm talking about. Because playing to the camera, which is such a ubiquitous metaphor for us, is a metaphor that emerged because of the broadcast economy. And so now, really what I'm talking to you about this afternoon is to try to think about, what's the new camera? If we're waiting for that, what is it? A popular answer to that question is that it lies somewhere in this cloud of buzzwords. And I think that's partially true, like radio. It's a necessary but not sufficient part of the problem. I think a lot of the answer lies inside this set of concepts and metaphors. Gaming platforms are inherently more interactive than many of the other technologies that we've learned to interact with. And the nature of their content is much more nonlinear, so it lends itself more to this kind of interactivity that I'm talking about. Obviously, there's other brain-busting technologies coming that are also radically changing things, but the point is, each of them is being used in a specific way and for a specific reason, and it's that I'm trying to get you to think about. Why co-create? Why is crowdsourcing better than not? Because of this. Because if you can focus your energies and your attentions on that underlying core purpose of what you're trying to do, that will help you filter out a lot of the noise. Many of the things that we focus on as key things like augmented reality are means to ends. They're not the purpose, the why. You don't want to end up in a place where all that we wind up doing with this is playing Minecraft by ourselves in some virtual reality space, right? Consider people playing an online game like Halo. This is an inherently conversational platform. All of these people are talking to each other. And if you take that paradigm and you add in things like in-app purchases, curated content, advertising, you've suddenly got a thing that looks very different from television and is very close to this kind of conversational marketplace at scale that I'm hinting at. People are now trying to create the same thing in virtual reality. This is a game from Ubisoft called Werewolves for VR headsets, and of course, ta-da! This is probably the most profoundly interactive conversational thing that's happened in the last 10 years. But to one of the points that Luke made earlier, it'll work for, a year, and then the next big thing will happen. And that's part of what's going on. So I think the challenge for us is, if you accept this underlying thesis that we're moving from what the broadcast economy did to us to whatever this new thing is and what's happening to us, how can we shape it? How can we make it better than it was last time? This is the challenge, the responsibility that we carry. If you listen to the story of Levittown and you feel a little queasy and you think, phew, wow, somebody figured out how far to put my refrigerator away from my television? And you don't like that, then the challenge for us is, how do we shape the world this time around so that the new camera doesn't have that same effect? Rodri is going to talk about this one. And this one is a profoundly distributed, decentralized conversational technology. And the things that it is enabling and doing to all of us without us knowing it are profound. Some people find that very frightening, some very exciting. In terms of organizational design, I think it is very exciting. Ever heard of that acronym before? Do you know what it means? DAO? So Rodri will explain it in more detail, but it means Distributed Autonomous Organization, and the blockchain is what makes it possible. It's the new GM org chart. But allowing conversations to happen at scale is a very disruptive, destructive thing as well, or it can be, because voices can speak that maybe we'd rather not hear. And this is part of the disruption that we're going through as a culture, as a society, is if the camera is no longer narrowly controlled by just one person, if we're all allowed to speak, how do we deal with the people that we don't want to hear? What happens when we actually have a conversation at scale and the results are somewhat disconcerting, right? So as we move into this world, this is the challenge that I wanted to talk about with you today. This is the challenge, one of the things that we're working on where I live. The broadcast economy birthed corporate titans. Something is definitely happening because they've all been usurped, but these logos are no more safe than their predecessors were. And the reason for that is because we're in this period of profound disruption as we move away from the camera towards whatever this new thing is. So, as a discussion, as a conversation. How can we seize a hold of that idea and use it to guide us through some of the things that Joe and Luke and the other folks have been talking about this morning to get to the right place, which may well be very different from the place that people think that we're going. Thank you very much. Time for any questions?
Wow. I think mine's are a little bit blown. There were no actual head explosions.
No,
but
no blood, so that's good.
but metaphorically, certainly. Well, look, hopefully, yeah, hands are going straight up. Is that Alistair?
Thanks, that was a great talk, thank you. I was fascinated by the Levittown example and the idea that these people behind the scenes were designing people's lives without them knowing about it. I wondered if you had considered whether the leaders in the online world are doing the same, such as your employer.
Well, of course we are, is the obvious answer to that question, because the economic and sociological forces around us make it almost irresistible not to, right? I think the issue for us all is to be aware of what's happening, and to be cognizant of it, and to try to do our best to force it in a direction that leads to some, whatever our consensus of good is, because that's always a topic of much debate as well, some outcome that is good and not evil. You know, it's easy to make fun of those of us who claim to do no evil, but if that's not going to be your goal, if that's not the stake you put in the ground, then you're obviously going to go the wrong way, right? You have to at least try, aspire. I don't have a better answer than that.
Hey, my question is a little bit about the blockchain then as a peer-to-peer decentralized network.
Yeah.
Do you think that essentially the blockchain that could arguably, I suppose, commoditize data could be the biggest existential threat to Google or Facebook that have built their businesses on the collection of data and the mining of it for good reasons, but actually having a commoditization of data could be the biggest challenge?
Yes, clearly. I mean, that was the point of this slide. I thought it was really clever how I got those logos to kind of line up. That was definitely the point of that slide, was to make it clear that I certainly, I can't speak for Larry or Sergey, am aware of the existential threats that are posed to the ways we currently do business, no question. My job in particular, because what I do at Google is run the startup program, so I spend all of my time talking to people who are actively trying to disrupt me, and you know, that's a really healthy thing. In terms of different data models and the ways that we deal with, store, and kind of extract value from data, I think that the magic sauce, the value proposition is always going to be in a capability to look at dizzying volumes of data and make sense out of it, and that capability is always going to be very valuable. I don't think it actually matters where the data lives, who owns it, where it comes from, as long as that capability is what's creating the value proposition. And so on that level, I would suggest that we're fairly relaxed about it. Any other questions? Cool.
Well, I'm sure as you let all of this sink in and filtrate through the many layers of your brain, there will be other questions that present themselves throughout the day. Can we have another round of applause? Fantastic, Mark Masterson.